We're live.
Okay. Welcome, folks. This is the Legislative State House Advisory Committee. We're meeting today to really discuss a look back in terms of the last year that we as a legislature have been doing our work remotely. And we really want to work with our partners in our legislative work, which is our Legislative Council, and our committee assistants, our support teams, to really find from their perspective what worked in the remote world and what didn't work. We all come to it from our own personal experience, being a legislator and working at home. But there was a lot of behind the scenes work that was happening, and it would be really helpful for us to glean on through that and really see what we could continue to incorporate in our legislative work once we get back into the building come January, and what really did not work. So that's going to be our focus on the folks that have volunteered to come forward today. So with that, I will turn it over. I'll begin with Nadine Martin, who is our supervisor of drafting operations for the Legislative Council. So Nadine, if you could come up. Nadine works a lot for folks. You go to Mike Ferrant works, and you go further in the back, and Nadine is way in the back there, also with editing. So it's really important to have your perspective and that of your office, Nadine. So welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. So it's all yours. If you could just identify yourself for the record, that'd be great.
Yes, and I'll just caution you, I do have a vocal tremor, so sometimes I can speak loudly and other times I cannot. But it seems like today we're okay. So I'm Nadine Martin. I'm the supervisor of drafting operations. We are part of the Office of Legislative Counsel. During session, we have 7 employees. Off session, we're 5, 3 full-time editors, I'm drafting technician, and myself. I do a little bit of both. During session, we add a seasonal drafting technician and a seasonal person who is a crossover drafting technician, editor, and administrative assistant, working primarily with the attorney who drafts resolutions. That person also fills in doing other things, but resolutions are a heavy workload. Your attorney drafts probably 400 of them. So that's why we have a dedicated staff person to get through that process. So I'm not sure how you want to go. I have 6 pages of notes, but it depends on really what you want to hear about. At one point, Mike Ferrant had suggested that maybe it would help to talk about what the workflow is so that there is some understanding. So those of you who may not know, a drafting technician, it's kind of a cross between what would have been a clerical assistant and an administrative assistant. They work on the documents. They implement the editor's changes. We still work on paper, marking it up with editor's marks. And part of the reason for that is because of the way that bills are drafted, you can't use track changes because it crosses things out and underlines them, and it interferes with the crossing out and underlining of the official documents. So we work on paper, the editors mark up changes, give them back to the technicians who input those changes into the documents. Documents come to us mostly from the attorneys. We also do edit for the Joint Fiscal Office. We will be doing some editing for your new human resources person, but primarily it's for your attorneys. There are Mike, 18 or 19 attorneys now. So we have 3 editors, and every document passes through our staff at every stage. And we do other things as well. So if a legislator submits a drafting request, you have an idea for something you want drafted as a bill or a resolution. It goes to the attorney, that's who you contact. The attorney contacts us, we set up the folder, we input the information into the database that will eventually drive the website, and we'll keep track of where the document is. So it comes to us as a request, goes back out to the attorney. The attorney drafts a document. That first draft comes back to us. So it comes to a technician, goes to an editor, gets marked up, comes back to the technician who inputs the changes or passes along to the attorney any questions. Sometimes the editors are not fixing grammar or punctuation or formatting. They're saying, I'm not clear on what you mean by this. Do you want to change it to say something else? Or they might say, this doesn't really follow our drafting manual that's put together by Jen Carvey and her team. Do you want us to make it conform, or is it language that you want to keep exactly the way it is? Sometimes if it's been through the courts, you don't want the editors changing it to our current style because a judge somewhere is very clear on what it means the way it stands now. So we're the intermediaries. When you're ready to introduce that bill, you sign it out to be introduced. That sign out sheet comes to us. We check all the names on it. We put those names onto the document. We format the document as a bill. It again goes through the editors, gets marked up, comes back to the technician, gets sent to the copy room who prints your official versions that get picked up by the House and Senate offices. We, in our team, also post those documents to the website. So, and the website interfaces with the database. So not to get too much into the weeds, but at each stage, every document will pass through us, back out to the attorney, back through us, and on to its next.
So this might be a good point just to stop and then see if there's questions or thoughts from folks. Jana?
So thinking about what can be done remotely and what needs to be done in person, I'm sort of thinking paper versus non-paper. So can you, you've talked a little bit about how much of it is paper, but can you tell us exactly what you do that is paper dependent as opposed to remote?
A lot of that changed last year, but we still are responsible for all of the paper that will have to be sent to public records. So the drafting request, the sign-out sheet, the bill is approved to go to print, the bill as it was introduced, if it passes, the bill as it passed the House, a proposal of amendment from the Senate, further proposal from the House, then as it passed both bodies, then it gets sent off to the Secretary of State's office, not by us, but by your parliamentary offices. But then it comes back to us to be formatted as an act. All of those documents, at least right now, have to be paper documents in a folder.
Can I follow up on it? So when you did this last year, when there was a period when nobody was in person, how was that all managed? You did it all remotely, I assume.
No.
And then it got printed or something got printed, or did you drive around?
No, because all of my staff was remote except me, because someone had to be
in the building.
It worked for it to be me because, as you know, in Calais, our internet is not good enough. I could not have been. But also because someone had to be.
I see.
So, but we did really develop and refine systems for moving documents remotely. I thought about putting this on your screen, but because it contains what could be considered confidential information, I'm not going to, but we developed what we call a whiteboard. So it's this huge spreadsheet that we can share online. And so it says what document came in and when was it received. So here's one at 3:10 at 7:45 a.m. Who took it in? The document management system number. I don't know if you know, but all your documents go through a management system, so they're identified by a number, so nobody could swap out somebody else for your document. A description of what it is, like an amendment to a certain bill and what it's about. We added a column because we learned it matters how many pages it has. If you're remote, are you going to print the whole thing? Are you going to, how long will it take? When it's due, and this could be anywhere from it's due at midday to it's due ASAP to we've got 3 documents due at 10:45 and one due at 11:15 and one due at 12. So all of that's in here. If it's the first time that we've seen it, the technicians go through and adjust the formatting. They call that giving it the 1.1 because the indentation has to be correct, the number of spaces after the period, the margins. So there was a column to indicate that you did that, then which editor it went to, who the technician is when it comes back, the date and time that it came back. Then we learned that we needed to save the marked up copies as PDFs so that people could see them remotely. So we had a shared drive. And so we saved the document there. So you mark that here, or if there were no corrections, then it says no PDF. When somebody goes looking for it, they understand why it's not there. And then this was for updating the folder, especially during the early days of the pandemic. Some of the attorneys were actually bringing in the folders, and so I would update them. When that stopped, I just had to keep track of the documents without any folders, which was its own interesting event. And then we had a column for notes. So whatever the attorney said in the email, like you've seen most of this, but not all of it, or please don't touch certain terms. They're terms of art. Don't change them. Things like that. So that all of that information would get transferred out. But this is how we kept track of doing.
It's really impressive what you and your staff did to keep our work moving.
Yeah.
I just
We
want to
didn't
say
realize
that.
it.
And I mean, and you did it all on the fly with no opportunity to sort of step back and figure it out. I mean, I'm amazed.
Well, thank you for that. I need to share that credit. We couldn't have done any of it without our IT staff,
Right.
who made every bit of it possible. Luckily, my staff has lots of good ideas. We had Zoom meetings to figure out how are we going to do this. And we had hiccups for a few weeks. You know, it was not smooth, simple, and easy. The attorneys had to adapt. We worked with them to figure out what would work. We had to figure out how to communicate with the committees when they wanted a committee bill, which somebody used to bring down to us. And now we have to contact the attorney and say, do you really want this bill? Because the committee says they want it. I mean, it was a learning curve. And there are parts of it that I think we could do going forward, but I think your IT staff and your parliamentary staffs and your attorneys and your drafting operations staffs turn themselves inside out so that you could do your work. And all of that is a good thing, but I think there is a danger in thinking that, oh, we just do it that way forever, or pick you up and move you to another building and you do it over there. It's not that we can't change. It's that this was a lot of change under very stressful circumstances. And as you say, it's just amazing that it worked.
I think as legislators, we don't realize what goes on behind the scenes. Kind of take it for granted, maybe, that document shows up, that change of draft shows up, that request you've made to a lawyer for a drafting request for a bill. You think it's just the lawyer who's working on this and not realizing what's really behind the scenes for that. It's quite an eye opener. And it's amazing you can do what you're doing with 7 people during the session when there's 180 legislators, but also amendments that come up on the fly when the House is in session or the Senate. All of that has to go through editing, every amendment. I'm just... It's amazing. So we've got some more questions here. Butch, Anthony, and did you have something, Allison?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you. Nadine, thank you for this explanation. As you know, some of us have been in the building more than a year or two. And I think maybe this explanation should go to all members. So they understand how you get from a simple idea that, oh, I think I'll draft this bill and I'll just do it for the heck of it. What it takes to get it from a thought to maybe some action in the committee and then finally to the floor. I never realized they had to go through all that many different things, just because if you bring it to you, it pops out the other end and magically comes out as a bill. And so thank you for that. I understand better that now what your job is and how you do it and how you interact with everybody in the building. My pointed question was going to be, how do you feel about moving out of the building? But I think you've already answered that. That it would be, seems to me, it would be just like what you would have to go through, almost what you went through last year. Even though you're only a few feet away, you're still remotely. Is that my assumption correct with that?
I would say that the position of legislative council as a whole is we really would prefer to stay where we are. If we have to move, there are things that could be done to make that work. But this is me personally. I think we need some time. I think we need to recover from what we've been through. We need to see what this remote session is going to look like. How does it work then? And then if you want to think about planning something different for the future, but take the time to plan. It's not that we can't turn on a dime. We've done it, but I don't think it's the best way to plan a long-term business process. I feel like we were magicians and we kept pulling rabbits out of hats. But I don't have any more hats.
Or rabbits.
Or rabbits, yeah. And so to decide what is going to work for your process, where are you going to be? Where are your attorneys going to be? Because we communicate very directly with them. When we were live, attorneys would be running up and down stairs or editors would be running up and down stairs. In remote, I gather that there were a fair number of cell phone conversations and things. that worked really well for my staff, but for me as a supervisor, it was a little bit difficult because then I have no idea what's going on. I know that the work gets done because I have this. So I just think if we're going to transform again, we should take it in a slow and measured way so that you get a good product at the other end and that people don't feel stressed out as much by it.
Anthony, Allison, and Janet, you're done, right, Butch?
It's along the same lines, actually. You know, when I interface with you, I walk to that room in the back where the little basket is and I hand you the bill with the signatures on it. And I don't see hardly anybody else, you know, I see one or two other people there. I'm just wondering, are there a bunch of other rooms that I'm missing? Or I'm just wondering, you know, where are these people? Because we're thinking about changing. I want to know what we're starting with.
Right. Well, right now, and we just really improved our space. Must be 2 or 3 years ago now because COVID intervened and I lost a year. But we got some cubicles back there and some desks that go up and down. I will tell you that my staff is not thrilled with cubicles, but it's so much better than it used to be. It's more like
Because you want it to be more quiet, I would think.
we needed it to be more quiet. It was a big open room. I have no idea how your attorneys draft bills sitting in a committee room, but I can tell you that for the editors trying to focus and edit in a room that's wide open was really difficult. So eventually, if there were the possibility to move to a space where they could have offices with doors that they could close, I'm sure they would love that, but eventually, right now, we have cubicles, and so you come into the front, and if you give me your sign-out sheet, I look at it, I ask if you signed it, which is the biggest thing members forget to do, is sign their own. Ask if there is a particular order that you want the other names to be in. Make sure that the sheet that you're turning it in for identifies the correct document is the one that you're giving me, the same one that you signed out, so that we don't introduce the wrong bill. And then you get to go away and my staff will take it over, send it out to the attorney who would have to approve and say, yes, that's the draft that I understood they were working on most recently. That's the one they want to introduce. It looks ready to me. Then we would send it through the editors again.
Allison, then Janet.
So we applaud your work for the last 16 months. Thank you so much. You know, we're all grateful to you all the time, but it's, you know, I think it's helpful to hear all that goes into what you do. I have a couple questions. One is, how do you interact with the attorneys who are in the Pink Lady? Because you have some remote actors who are, they're present, but it's a little different. What are your takeaways? What are you going to keep out of all this work that you had to pivot doing? What are the good things that you're going to keep out of that? I'd appreciate knowing that, and or giving us a general sense, because we don't need to have the deep dive. And I guess my takeaway from your testimony just now is that the key is that you are in close proximity with the attorneys.
Yes. Yes.
If that's correct. So that's my big takeaway that I hear you.
That's correct. So the Pink Lady has always been something of an issue for the Pink Lady attorneys, but they would come and see us also. We also, for a while, I'm not sure when we expanded our staff that this was still the case, but we would have a spare workstation so that an attorney from the Pink Lady who needed to could come down into our space and tap away on the computer and use our printer. But they have to haul their documents back and forth. Some of them are happy doing that, and others I think it doesn't work as well for. But they also could call us up. The things that we will keep, I think, are, for instance, the electronic whiteboard, because we can share it, and because, although I think only some of the attorneys looked at it, the attorneys could also look at it. So an advantage for them was they could see what's in the queue ahead of me, who's working on my document if I suddenly need to contact the editor. They could get a better sense of all the work that was going on. We always had a whiteboard, but it was like this. So you would come into our office and you could see. And my staff used to joke about some of the attorneys that would come in and see that there are 3 jobs due at 10:15, so I'm going to make mine 10 o'clock. So I get it back before I get that busy. I think we will keep that, Senator Clarkson, because it gives us more information, and B, it's helpful if people can't be there. Suppose you had a snow day and people can't come in. Well, now they could see this before. I don't know what they would have done.
May I just do a follow-up, which is, so the pink lady's been a bit of an issue. Would it help, I mean, long-term, because part of our job is long-term too, interim and long-term. It clearly sounds like it would help if Ledge Council was unified, all of Ledge Council being in one place.
I think that's going to be your decision. From what I've heard, there are some attorneys who are happy in the pink lady. So.
Janet, and then the other Janet.
So thank you, Nadine, because I was there to see you every day. They're struggling, and people don't realize, you know, when you're the person there, how much physical paper and folders and files and all that to keep track of. And so thank you for that. And my other question was based pretty much what Senator Clarkson, like what did work and what would we take away from that? Because the future is here as far as, you know, things that what happened at the pandemic, a lot of business practices are changing. But it sounds like you answered that, and that you would keep the whiteboard. And
we would keep the whiteboard, and I know that it's all going to depend on how whoever is making decision about staffing says that staff are going to work. Some of my editors would like to remain at home. I can think of ways that might work if they rotated who came in. I don't think outside a pandemic, this is just me, I don't think we should try to go through a session without at least 1 and maybe 2 attorneys in the building. But if you have, I mean, what did I say, attorneys, editors, but if you have the ability for somebody to work remotely, maybe one can work at home. Maybe they can trade off so they don't have to commute. I don't really know how it would work, but I don't think it works for the long term to have none of them there. If you're there.
thank you.
Janet?
So I'm not sure that if you even have an answer to this, but if the attorneys move to Aiken, I guess the question I'd want you to think about is, if that happens, would it be your preference to move with them or to stay in the State House as your own unit? And maybe you don't have an answer to that at the moment. I'm listening, you know, you and I talked the other day as well, and I'm hearing what you're saying about needing some time to, you know, to think through some of the stuff that you did on the fly, and try to do it more thoughtfully. And I'm paying attention to that. So I guess, so the question that raises for me is that if the attorneys move, do you want to move later, or do you want to not move at all? And you don't need to answer it right now. I just want you to be thinking about it, I guess.
I'll think about it.
That's fair.
Yeah,
That's fair.
but that's really where it
Yeah.
comes down to for
Right.
me. Because you're a smaller group, you wouldn't necessarily need to move with them. But what we want to do is we want to make things work as best as we can.
Right. I mean, I do think it's important to keep in mind that we are part of Ledge Council. We used to be, was head of IT and
Right.
us and
Everything.
operations. And
Exactly.
so everything got split off, but we are still part of the attorneys. So
Exactly. Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. Well, to me, it's the question, and so.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So that leads to the question I was kind of percolating. How much contact do the attorneys have with the editing? I mean, I've heard from my attorney for my committee that editing is really, really important for her work and for what she sees for her colleagues. I've also heard that sometimes there's issues when my legislative lawyer is in the Pink Lady. And when she comes over to the State House, sometimes she has trouble accessing those documents on a State House computer. So she has to carry her laptop for that. And she indicated that to me when we were in the building. So I'm just wondering, for the lawyers, how much do they really depend on you folks and having that one-to-one personal interaction? Or can some of that be done remotely or not?
I think that's a question for your attorneys.
But what you're seeing on your editing end, you said the attorneys are constantly going up and down and talking to your folks and then going back. Are some attorneys more emailing some of your folks, or do they physically come in? Do you know?
It's both. And I will say, and I know you all experienced this too, during remote, the email explosion was crushing us. So if we can get back to doing some things in person, that would be a relief. But there always were some emails that went back and forth.
Crushing, that's a good word for it.
So another question I have, how closely do you work with the copying room? The copying room?
We send documents to them, including your official bills.
And those are done electronically, sending that?
We send it electronically. We used to, and we still do, deliver what's called the backing sheet or the cover sheet, but they can print it electronically if they had to. And Tony in the copy room was very good during this remote session in helping out, picking up a lot of things that otherwise we were trying to figure out how we would do this.
So one thing that we've been grappling with here is really seeing what did work during this whole remote time. And one thing you mentioned that might work is some of the staff, your editors may want to work at home, but there's got to be a balance there for them to come in. Are there other items or situations that you see that would be good practice to carry through when we're back in the building at all? Maybe it's going to take some time to think it through.
I think it will take some time. It's not clear to me, and I'm sure it probably isn't clear to any of you yet either, exactly how it's going to work when you're in the building, but you're also trying to make things available remotely to people. So I don't know, for instance, what our communications with the attorneys will be if they're in the committee live on Zoom and we're trying to communicate with them. I think we have to see how it begins to work.
Questions? Nadine, do you have more to share with us?
Oh, give me a minute here.
But look at, it's yellow. She's so like such an editor. Yeah, highlighted. It's all.
Well, but I do want to be clear that it isn't just the editors too. Some of my technicians may like to continue working at home. Some of our people have young children who haven't been able to be vaccinated yet. I don't know how they're going to feel about
Right. Right.
probably the same as some of your members about coming into a building where we don't quite know what's going on. But for me, I would say the good thing was we learned some systems that make it possible to work remotely. The downside was the real lack of an ability to have team camaraderie. My team are really excellent people, and I could get together with them on Zoom, but it's just not the same.
Right. Did you have some new folks at all, or is your team been there for a while? Or did you have new folks?
We had one brand new editor whom our senior editor has never yet met in person. Had to train her remotely.
Oh,
Yeah. We had another editor who I think was not quite through her first year when the pandemic hit. Yeah, I was very fortunate that my two technicians have been coming back. Caitlin's been there 5 or 6 years now. I've been there 15 years. Kim, I think, is in her 3rd or 4th year. But the editors, this is a separate issue, but it's hard to keep them on the page. It's not what an editor can make working productively. It's just not.
So Allison, did you have something?
Yeah.
And we'll go to Butch.
I just wanted to ask, just following up on the remote, that'll sugar out how that, but that may mean you may need less, if you end up landing on a balance of remote and present with team camaraderie, maybe once a week or whatever it ends up sugaring out to be, might you need, and I don't mean this, it's thinking, might you need less space is, I guess, one of my questions, or would you always want to make sure everybody had their own place? But I guess I think you're going to have to figure that out and see who's going to want to really be primarily remote and who's not, and how that changes over time.
I think we will have to figure that out.
Yeah.
Butch.
Allison asked my question. Thank you.
Well, that's
Great
good.
minds that think alike.
That's because you switch places.
Yeah, yeah.
It's we have a new perspective.
You do.
This is like, I have a whole new perspective.
You do. He might
They do
not.
too. Well, that's part.
It's easier to see the board from there.
Yes, although I'm so blind that reading Stephen's writing from a distance is just like hopeless.
Similar up close.
Eric, did you have a question?
Just a curiosity, Eric Philhorn, BGS. So when you said you physically edit, and then would you scan that and send it to the person who would be doing the input into the system? Was that your business process?
Correct.
I see.
So it gets scanned back to the technician. And then that scan of the correction also gets emailed out to the attorney so that the attorney can see what the changes were. Because we used to just put the marked up documents in the folder and hand it.
Hand it and they
Right.
go, yeah, okay.
So we get these documents in, we save them, and we email them back out. Yes.
Mike Fern.
I remember a little bit of your stuff from when we moved you up to Dewey temporarily a couple of years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Good team.
It's, my team is really astonishing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just amazing. You're behind the scenes and people don't even realize you're there. Most committees, if you're not working on the draft yourself,
The editors.
doing your committee work and making the amendments and working with your lawyer intimately with those changes, you say to the committee, well, the drafting is being done, it's down in editing. So you just have this in mind, it's over in this place, editing, and then it's hurry up, get it done so that we can get the new draft and do our work.
But-
That's the level of understanding I think that many legislators have.
And-
It's down at editing.
And the level of reliability in editing, because, Becky will say it's down at editing, I should have it back at 2:15. Like it's a very reliable machine
Yeah.
of people.
We try, yes, thank you, that's, we feel it when we don't, if we miss that deadline.
But the one thing that I was experiencing as a legislator, waiting for a draft in the remote world, it took longer.
It's,
Because I know the lawyer kept saying, well, they're really backed up. They've got a lot of work. It's taking longer. And I sort of attributed it to well, we're not in the building. We're doing everything remotely. Things are not going as efficiently as they would if we were in the building. That's where my mind went. Maybe I was wrong.
Mine went faster, so.
Mine were a lot
faster.
Yeah, mine were slower.
it would really
Depended on the day, sort of.
On the time.
For instance, if the editor is editing the capital bill, to scan a 50-page document is very slow.
Yeah.
It's very slow. If you're editing a 2-page document and you scan it, that's pretty fast.
Right. Yeah, depended on the day and the document.
Right, and what was ahead of our work.
And also how the internet is working that day.
Oh, that.
Oh, that.
All right.
Stephen?
Stephen Fry, BGS. I'm very much appreciating your testimony and feedback. I'm a planner and architect, and that's kind of my background. And I'm very interested in details. And one of the things that Chair, you were sort of alluding to it is over the pandemic, in general, were things being more effective, less effective in terms of the quality of the work product that you are working on for all the different groups that you were participating with? Were you able to track the success of the efforts that you were doing? Were things taking longer to edit with many cycles because you didn't have the face-to-face interaction? Or was it easier because there was working remote, people could share screens, that kind of thing?
I think each document has its own story. I don't think there is a generalization that I could give you.
Sure.
I love that. Each document had its own story.
Yeah, that's a wonderful vignette.
I'm waiting for the cabaret skit on this, which she will write. Like a document having its own story.
Right.
You created it.
I think part of the question is really just, well, we know that we did what your team, along with other members of Ledge Ops, with the legislators, did all these amazing things together. And it's really kind of hard to understand on maybe some levels where the metrics or measures that can help us, if we had a compass and say, gee, let's go this way or this way, with a mix of hybrid work and, working remote, working in person. That's, I think, part of what we're asking about today is, if you had a compass, what direction would you have us go from your perspective?
And I think some of that depends on each member of the staff. As the supervisor, I would not have you keep my entire staff remote.
Right, but how do you
Some
reach
of
critical
these
mass
staff,
of connections and?
Exactly. And I think you need to hear from your attorneys because the bulk of the work that we do is directly with them. And they're with you. They're either with you as the individual sponsor learning what you want them to draft, or they're with you in committee. We don't really have much to do with the testimony, but when they draft for you, that comes through us. So, and I'm sure that they have different points of view too, but you have Michael Grady here.
Is there anything else you want to share with us, Nadine? You're here.
I don't think so, other than I think once in a while you also need to step back and recognize that with your staff, what an amazing thing you did. I think we were the first state in the country to go fully remote. You got through a whole session, as I've heard some of you say, you enacted important legislation. You have amazing staffs. Do everything you can to hang on to them. And thank you for your service. This cannot have been easy trying to make policy in a little box.
No kidding.
Hollywood Squares.
So we're all working to get everything back in our building.
And it's interesting to hear how many of your challenges were our challenges. I mean, the informal sharing of information, to getting to yes sometimes doesn't happen in that little box. So I appreciate your challenges because they were in many ways ours, slightly different, but very similar.
Well, our work wouldn't happen without you folks.
Oh,
That's for sure. I want to thank.
We wouldn't have jobs without you. So.
We wouldn't be here without our. Goes round and round.
So we're mutually dependent.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Nadine. That's great.
Nadine, before you go, I just wanted to apologize. I had to step out for a court hearing. You and I have spoken on several occasions about your testimony here today, and I'm assuming you had some conversation about the short-term move versus a long-term situation. I don't know if you did or not, but I'm hoping that you did.
A little bit.
A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
We did have Michael Chernick. I don't know, are you in his place?
He has asked me to testify for him.
Okay. So Michael O'Grady, come on up.
Did you put them in there?
This reminds me of my committee doing those Forest and Park resolutions when we had 4 mics in the committee room. You and Michael Chernick and then the folks from Forest and Parks.
So I'm Mike O'Grady with Legislative Counsel. And last week you asked me to communicate with attorneys about what worked well and what didn't work well and what they would recommend going forward. You didn't hear a lot back from them. So this morning we forced the issue in legal staff meeting and had the discussion and agreed on what I could come forward to testify about today. And Michael Chernick graciously volunteered his slot time to me to bring that forward. But before I do that, though, I want to assert how important drafting operations is to Legislative Counsel, the work that they do to ensure that the quality of the work product is what it is, which is generally very, very good, is amazing. They're incredible, intelligent, very organized people that really are the backbone of Legislative Counsel. And I don't think Nadine mentioned the fact that they do almost as much work in the summertime as they do during the session, because that's when we codify everything that you have enacted into the green books, and that takes an enormous amount of time and effort as well. So they really should be commended and recognized for the work that they do. And I truly appreciate them as an individual attorney in Ledge Council. So with that said, I'll talk about what our legal staff referenced as working well and some concerns and issues with what we think worked well. I think you all saw the value that remote testimony provided. You had witnesses from all over the state come in, and you were getting input from people that you may not have received input from. And it was very easy for them to participate. And it provided something that hadn't really been there in the past. And it was easy to organize that as well, or maybe Ron will disagree with me. And that remote participation was very valuable to the Legislative Council attorneys as well. Many of us had issues that were ongoing during the remote time, whether or not it was childcare or medical issues or elder care. And the ability to participate remotely, both in committee and on the floor, was a true asset for us. We were able to get our jobs done through that remote tool and through what Kevin and the rest of IT were giving us as tools in order to get that done. So that did work well for us. And we would like to have some of that remote ability available to us going forward. Not every day. We understand that. We understand that you recommend being back in the building and standing committees being back in the building. But the reality right now of COVID times is as Nadine referenced, we have kids that are not vaccinated, and we're not sure when they're going to be vaccinated. Some of our kids are in daycares, and daycares are opening, some of them are 4 days a week, some of them at reduced hours, closing at 4:30. And charging extra if you pick up your kids after 4:30. So there needs to be some flexibility for our attorneys, especially those with children or other obligations, to do some of their work in a fluid schedule through remote tools. And we would appreciate that ability. We're not asking for it all the time. We're just asking for it when the issues arise, and that's the only way that they can fulfill their obligations and do their job. Now, with that said, remote was not always the best thing. It was not always positive. It generated an expectation that we were always available. And I think every attorney has a story about how they were in one committee, they were asked to join another committee, and then they got a call to talk to a legislator directly. So you were managing 3 different inputs, services at the same time. And that sort of became the expectation, especially for some of the more busier attorneys, that they would be able to do all of that and fulfill the needs at once, which was never, sometimes you can sit in committee, physically sit in committee and be on your laptop and draft or answer emails or somehow provide input to another committee. But it got to the point where because we have so many devices now, we can communicate on so many different levels, and that came the expectation. And so I would recommend that expectation be scaled back a little bit, or in a physical setting, it's no longer the expectation and something that we could manage through just being physically present. The other things were the streaming, the recordings. They present multiple issues. one of which was referenced earlier. I can't remember by whom, but things were recorded that should not have been recorded. Things were recorded of legislators who were talking about things that are of non-legislative nature. Things public were recorded. And that has always happened in the past. It's always been on the CDs, right? Now it's not on CDs. It's being streamed to YouTube, where it's unless we affirmatively take it down, it's permanently present. And that permanent presence of those recordings leads to things that you might not realize, like manipulation of those recordings on social media, so that the images or the recordings of you or your staff are then manipulated to provide whatever message that the person that's manipulating wants to. For example, one of our attorneys was giving a testimony. That testimony was taken, manipulated, turned into its own website, which the attorney was giving a demeaning and disparaging name, moniker, which was then passed around on the internet. And then he was referred to that name in committee thereafter by advocates for that. So I don't know how you manage that. Are there other mediums besides YouTube to use to stream the recordings? Is there a way to stream so it doesn't get recorded permanently? So there are some issues with the recordings, the erroneous recordings, the manipulation of the recordings. And they felt a little bit invasive at times and I'm sure you all felt that. You were looking directly into your homes.
Right.
And hopefully that will be less of an issue going forward. But that was part of the issue as well. Now with Zoom, the big issue that we had with Zoom was the chat function. The chat function was used in some committees very, very discreetly, in some committees not. In fact, in some committees, the chat function was kind of an open source tool where other witnesses or advocates in the room were allowed to use the chat function as well and would criticize the witness with the chat while the witness was in the chair and the witness could see that criticism.
Oh my God.
Yep.
And so it was at times used to intimidate witnesses and intimidate staff.
Acceptable. That's not acceptable.
Both my committees didn't use chat during our meetings.
Well, that's why I said that some committees.
No, I'm just curious. Was that not a uniform thing?
I didn't allow.
We didn't allow chat.
We used chat, but
Did we link documents in it?
we linked documents, but witnesses were not allowed to ask questions, or we weren't allowed to ask questions of witnesses through chat.
But you're talking about a witness doing it.
Pardon?
I think it happened once in my committee where a witness actually put something in the chat.
Or somebody that was in line to be a witness
This is unacceptable.
was using the chat function to criticize an attorney that was testifying.
And then there's the YouTube comments too.
Well, then there's.
But we don't see those.
Yeah,
There were YouTubes about my committee.
so,
There was social media about my committee
Yeah, probably about
at
all
the
of them.
beginning, at the beginning.
Thanks. That's a good reminder about what we can do about chat, like disable it.
and so another aspect about this,
We have a question here, Michael, just.
The chats did not go out on YouTube, is that right, or they did?
Oh, that was another issue.
It's
That was another issue.
No, Kevin's saying no.
It did not.
But
It didn't
folks
begin.
who were listening on YouTube wanted to be able to
Right in the
have the
chat.
chat enabled for them.
Instead, they texted us.
So that was an
That got-
issue
that
that
did
was
get shut down.
percolating out there and.
Meaning they wanted to join in the.
If they were watching us on YouTube and they wanted to participate or make a comment, they wanted to be able to have access to the
And they
chat.
did in the beginning.
And they did text on a regular basis,
Yeah.
most of us. If you bothered, I wouldn't use my phone often during, but they did find a way to communicate.
Well,
That was lobbyists that connected with me.
well, that was one of the issues that I felt that because we were remote and we just didn't have the opportunity to speak to our committee mates, either out in the hall or during some downtime or whatever. So everything we said and did was scrutinized. As Senator Clarkson was saying, I mean, the texting was unbelievable. The amount of texts that were going back and forth and back and forth. And it was a difficult way to communicate and an easy way to stumble.
Right, I agree. I think we all, staff and legislators, experience that in some form or another. Just because of the openness and the extreme transparency, which is good, there's also extreme, examination.
So how did, maybe I just was unaware. So how did the witness get into our chat?
Witnesses are
Anybody that was-
admitted in
Witnesses are in the room.
They're in the room,
Yeah.
so they have access to
Zoom
the chat.
room. They have the ability to use the chat function.
Yeah.
But, man,
Yeah, go ahead.
so just to your point about the manipulation of images, we haven't been through an election cycle yet.
Yeah, right.
Post Zoom life, but we're open, we're I think up for a rude awakening on how our images are going to be manipulated in this next election. It's not going to be pretty. And sadly, you've seen it in microcosm with an attorney. I was not aware of that situation, and I don't know who you're talking about or what happened, but I sadly think that's going to be the ugly side of the transparency and the in good faith openness of our legislative life.
That begs the question that I think we really need to look at the structure of our openness and maybe put some rules and parameters around that. And that may be a recommendation that we make.
I had one more thing to look at before I was going to recommend something. And the one more thing to look at is to how the recordings are going to change the relationship between the legislature and the courts.
Oh, yeah.
Because now you have a fairly extensive legislative history of every committee meeting, and you will have attorneys that can be able to go through those recordings and scrutinize and try to find a comment or an expression or a response by a committee that might not have shown up on an audio recording, but will show up on video. And then so you've created this new legislative history that may change interpretations by the courts, because courts probably aren't going to listen to the 25 hours of testimony that you took on that bill. They're going to focus on the 3 minutes that the advocate for one side is going to bring forward to you and look at. And so you might see these recordings affecting how courts decide cases in the future.
Yep.
So are our floor sessions also there forever? They are, aren't they? I mean, that's another, we didn't used to record the floor.
Right, the floor wasn't recorded, it was live, but not.
And now it's all out there on YouTube, which I always make sure never to say anything.
Right. You know, Michael, I'm glad you brought up the legislative intent, because when I first became a legislator, it was really clear that, and not all committees did this, very few committees did at the time, record their testimony in their committee deliberation. There were a few committees that did. I happened to be on the ones that did. And it was really clear back then that those recordings were done in case anything went to court. and to determine legislative intent. And I think for the majority of our colleagues, they have no clue, pre-pandemic, why those committee proceedings were recorded. I always made sure to say to my committee members, they're being recorded because if it ends up in court, they'll go back to those recordings for legislative intent. But I think the majority of our colleagues have no clue that that's why our deliberations are recorded. So now we've really opened up the floodgates on that with this being live streamed.
And on the public records requests.
And on the ADA issue as well, because now you're providing this
Open forum.
open forum that some people can't fully access because of whatever reason. And we have received requests for transcripts of recordings, and transcripts are timely and expensive, but they are also an accommodation that we may need to make for certain persons. So that's the remote work was fantastic. The remote tools allowing people to participate, allowing witnesses, allowing the attorneys to participate. And we hope to have some of that available going into the future. We think that that does work, but the recordings present some problems that we would, and this is a recommendation, would like you to create some rules or process or guidance around so that committees and committee chairs know expectations, know how they can be used to the best of their intent, and our understanding of the fact that the recordings have weight as legislative history and public records. And so that's generally what we would recommend.
Allison?
Have we had a public records request since we've been on Zoom? I'm sure we have.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Lots.
Yeah,
Lots.
yeah, because all the ones I've had to deal with have been before Zoom. So I am sure some of you who are often subject to public records requests, because I think it presents equally challenging problems there. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks.
Janet, then Butch, and then
So,
John, did you have your hand up?
I think that's a great recommendation, and I'm going to ask who is going to tell us how to do that. Is that you and Kevin and who else?
I think you're probably, and this, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because we're probably going to need to take on some work, right? And we're probably going to have to coordinate with the parliamentary offices about what they need, because they have their own concerns. And
I mean, I'm serious. I think it's really important what you're talking about, and but
Can't joint rules do that?
we can't. Well, they
Joint
will
alone.
need staff help just
Yeah.
as we would. So what I'm doing is saying who is the staff who can help us do that?
it's probably going to be me
You and Kevin and
and Kevin,
And Tucker, maybe.
and Betsy Ann. And
so can we formally ask you to start thinking about that?
And I, if it's okay with all of you, I will bring it up in our next joint rules committee.
Well, that's,
Yeah.
sure, we can bring it up.
It's
But that
agenda.
should be
Like
one
on
of our
one.
recommendations
Should be one of
to
our
the management
recommendations,
committee
so
and
it's-
also joint rules.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and JLMC because
Right.
it's all the same.
So.
it doesn't necessarily need to be a rule. It could be guidance,
No.
right? It
Yeah.
could be like,
Yep, yeah.
this is-
It's formal.
But some of it's
Right.
guidance, some of it's
Right.
rules, some of it's business, but some of it may be
And Butch
finding
and
somebody
John.
other than you two.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you're in the queue. Okay, so I've got Butch, John, Eric, and Joe. Benny.
Michael, you created some interest. So, but I want to.
How unusual.
Yeah, I want to go back to your first point about accommodating employees' personal needs in this time of hopefully coming out of COVID. I'm wondering, would that just be better off handled by the management of your shop just without getting the legislature's hands involved in that? Need guide, I don't know, do you need guidance from us to be able to do that, or?
I don't think we need guidance from you
I hope not, but
about when to give staff
yeah.
sick leave or when to give family leave. And to an extent, I know Arlene is working on determining or creating uniform policies and leave forms for that. What we would like is the tool to be available. You know, one of our attorneys this morning gave the example. She has children. Her partner wasn't there to provide backup care, so she had to take care of her kids. But she had a bill on the floor because it was a late night session. She was able to use Zoom to communicate with her committee and her committee chair to fulfill the work that would be expected of her when you had a bill on the floor.
That makes sense.
And so that type of tool is something that we would hope would remain available to the attorneys, especially those with those type of obligations that they can't do both without a tool like that.
So I'm wondering, Alice, I see you're scribbling like crazy on that. So is that, I'm wondering how we would recommend anything, or do we need to just let you handle it?
I think it would be a combination.
Well, I think our recommendation for that tool being available, it stems directly from your vote the other day to recommend that standing committees be back in the State House in person, with staff in person with them. And what we are requesting is that we're not requesting that be changed. We're requesting that at times that their staff be accommodated to use a Zoom tool or other remote tool when is necessary to fulfill both their parental or other obligations.
The motion.
Now, the motion was just for standing committees.
We didn't talk about this now.
We weren't.
Okay.
About the staff. Yeah, I would hope the chairs would have their conversation with their attorney to really get a feel for the attorney's workload and pressures that they have elsewhere. I know my attorney, the attorney for my committee, she and I are pretty clear about what her schedule is and where she's needed elsewhere. And also home requirements as well. I would hope, and I know other chairs are doing that, at least on the House side, with their lawyers. I think we need to be as accommodating as we can be. John, and then Eric, and then Joe.
I'm going back to the courts determining legislative intent. It seems like in some cases that could be really useful if it's accurate in determining what the intent was, but how small of a snippet can there be and still be considered to determine legislative intent? Like if you have one member that is pontificating about a bill, could that be construed by a court to mean intent when only one person said it?
You know, courts can use many different things to prove legislative intent, and they have used snippets of recordings from the legislature in the past. The most prominent example is the Vermont Yankee recordings of Senate Finance. And the committee continuing to reference public health and safety when that is something that was clearly preempted by the Atomic Energy Act. And the law firm in that case was a very skilled Manhattan law firm, and they were able to find those little snippets that best benefited their argument. And so you can get just small little snippets that help.
But it wouldn't be that if one member was pontificating and that it could be construed as that was the intent when.
Well, that's our concern, right? It's that can now be used
It sounds like with the Yankee case, it was finding repeated uses of that phrase by multiple members over.
There was one member on the floor of the Senate that was a little bit more quoted more than others. So it can, I understand your point that the opposing side would provide further context to the court, or the court should look into it, him or herself. But I can't say that a small snippet would never be relied upon. I think it could be. I mean, we write act summaries that the court relies upon, and on the top of the act summary, we say this is not to be relied upon. And they rely on it. So.
Content's hot.
Eric and Joe and then Janet.
I was curious, are you going to resume the audio recordings?
You mean the CD?
The CDs? How is
I don't
that?
think we've made that decision. per se.
Right now, there's nothing in the archive of this year, right?
Well,
I don't know. I mean, those are conversations I think we'll have with Ron Wild when he comes in terms of committee assistants.
And Kevin.
And Kevin,
right,
talking
'cause
about the recordings.
we weren't having them on CDs. They were on.
They haven't been on CDs in probably at least 6 years now.
All right, there,
They're MP3s.
on a web
Right.
service.
But you're talking about those type of recordings anyway.
Yeah, just as YouTube, the state archive now, or?
It's a good question.
Right.
Sounds like a policy discussion to be had.
Yeah.
Joe and then Janet.
So, Michael, an observation first with respect to the court system. I was on a half-hour court conference a little while ago. They use a format called WebEx, which is roughly equivalent to YouTube. And as I'm on the screen with about 9 other attorneys and a private investigator starts chatting with one of the attorneys. All of that information is popping up on a screen where somebody is going to have access to it at some point in time. What we have done here in your description is a snippet. We have amplified the number of snippets that can become available based on what we have done with this YouTube access. But it's really not any different than what we were doing when we were simply recording voices. It is apt to be used in a situation where a court is confused about legislative intent. But 90% of the time, legislative intent is determined by the language of the statute itself. The danger is when some vague thought is injected and they're trying to determine what clarity is necessary, that one side in a litigation has the resources to go through 25 hours worth of YouTube videos and the other side does not.
That was exactly the point that one of our attorneys made this morning.
I recognize that is a problem, but it's not a new problem. It's an old problem. But with this new format, we have provided more available snippets for them to use and make.
And it's a lot easier to just go to your computer and search on YouTube or go to the link to the live stream than it is to go to archives or go to Kevin and get a recording, get the WAV file. The WAV file is not as easy to navigate as YouTube.
I completely agree with you that it has become easier. And that's something that we do have to wrestle with. But I do have a question for you, and that is your own staff, if they need the flexibility or their contractual issues on your end about whether or not they have the ability to participate remotely or not, is that something that we need to change?
What do you mean by contractual issues?
Well, they are all hired under contract, I'm assuming, in some fashion. I've never been party to that process, but I'm assuming there's a contract out there for even your employment with the state.
No, we're at will, and the employment agreement we have is effectively we sign the personnel policy, which sets the terms and conditions of our employment.
That personnel policy is created by whom?
It was created by the Office of Legislative Counsel, but that is probably something that's going to change with Arlene and HR over time.
Okay, so that's something that we need to make a recommendation to the folks we're making, JLMC, the rules committees, we need to make a recommendation about how that should, something as simple as the chairs being given training and instruction on how to be flexible with attorneys who are working with their committees. I'm just trying to think this out on how this committee would make a recommendation that would come to some kind of fruition for you.
That's a fair point, you know.
So I sort of a related thought, and it's a broader issue that I wanted to bring up, but you're talking about being flexible with staff is part of it, is that I hope that, I'm not sure what forum it is, but that we are, in addition to all the other things that we've been talking about, that we also make recommendations about what people do when they don't feel well. And if you feel sick, don't come into the building. You don't have to have COVID, just don't come in, stay home. And if we do that, then we need to do exactly what you're talking about, is we need to have ways for people to participate remotely. And I hope that's one of the things that comes out of this last year and a half, that, you know, I'll tell you, one of the things that I like about the remote work is I didn't get sick last year.
Yep.
I didn't
That's a
get
big
sick
plus.
with anything. And that's a first, because just being in that building, inevitably I got something.
The crossover crud.
Yeah, and so, you know, none of us need it. And so it's related to this concern that you brought up, that I think we all need, one, to be flexible, and two, responsible for not bringing stuff into the building. That's my
Something you need
speech.
to have in a policy?
I don't know.
Well, I
No, but in an understanding.
Well, in the personnel agreement that you have, it seems to me there should be some reflection of that intent. But this committee needs to make recommendations, and that may require some rules changes, that chairs are instructed to provide that flexibility when deemed necessary. I can see some chairs saying, screw that, I want that person in the room all the time.
Yeah, I can see that.
And there has to be a way for the rules committees to take that by the horns and provide that flexibility when it's necessary.
After COVID, I don't hear a chair doing that. I think after this last 16 months together, I think everybody's appreciating the ability to turn to being flexible.
And we know how to do it. I mean,
Yeah, and we now know how to do it
it's
and have less fear of it.
possible for people. Members can't vote if they're remote, but other than that, they can participate. And staff has learned how to do it, for better or for worse. Sometimes it's, you know, makes it easier, and sometimes I know it's harder. But that's one of the things I hope comes out of this is.
Yeah, I agree, but I want to put a little pushback in there, because we have experienced this, and I would agree completely. We have an understanding of how it should work. We will not be occupying these seats forever. And there may be a future pandemic, which we need to do our best to try to set up the legislature so that you do have that flexibility when necessary. And there are people who have never been through this experience before.
Yeah.
That goes to one of our lessons learned in here, which is the continuity of government and plans and embedding those kinds of.
So Michael, was there any feedback that you received from the attorneys that felt that they missed something from not being physically in the committee room with the committee? Did they feel they could pick everything up through the Zoom world? I mean, sometimes they can pick up little nuances.
Sure. You know, just
In that?
as Nadine said, that every bill has its own story. Every attorney has their own opinion of how the remote worked. Some really loved it and want to continue working remotely forever. And some really missed the being present, being in committee, seeing the interactions, interacting with other witnesses and advocates, being able to go into the hallway and have a private conversation. You know, from my perspective, I love being physically present to get ideas, because I hear the testimony. Not all testimony is worthwhile, but a lot of it is, and it generates thought process. It generates ideas, and then I can go talk to an advocate or an agency and try to come up with ideas that the legislature to affect the legislature's intent. And so that's why I like it. It's a creative function or creative tool for me.
So it just seems that there needs to be some flexibility and kind of a middle ground in terms of how we go forward with our lawyers and the remote. And that's clear for everyone. It's clear for legislators what the expectation is. It's clear for your staff what the expectation is. And how we achieve that is what maybe we need to grapple with. Is it something that is really put down on paper and the policies written out? Is it something that you work with? You, meaning someone, works with the chairs to say these are now the policies to really work with your legal staff, have an open communication, figure it out. I don't know. Stephen?
It reminds me, this is a very important question that kind of reaches into like workplace protocols, or what I would call sort of like a uniform, informal agreement between coworkers and others that interact with each other, kind of like how you choose to interact and do different things. And that can sometimes take a life of its own and be overly codified into very voluminous policies and procedures that people don't necessarily read. And it can get, potentially problematic because of that, and sort of miss the point of people connecting with each other and communicating on a more continual basis about expectations and kind of shared ideas. And so it's just kind of an interesting question. It's like, how much of this do you take on, and how detailed do you go in the development of these protocols or guidelines, because they may end up eating you at the end because they'll take over.
Mm-hmm.
So I see it as a tool that we use in our training, and we do training for committee assistants, we do training for attorneys, we do training for committee chairs, we do training for new legislators. I think it becomes a guidance document in the training materials. It doesn't necessarily need to be a rule. It's a guidance document on how to accommodate remote participation, how to use the remote tools effectively, how to prevent misuse of the remote tools. I think it doesn't have to be overly detailed. I think it could probably be a couple pages long with continued training on it from biennium to biennium.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you would agree that necessity should be attached to remote use, as opposed to the arbitrary will and whim of any particular attorney who decides, I don't want to go to Montpelier today.
Right. Yeah, I think there has to be an obligation that, one of our attorneys said, hey, I live an hour and a half away, but I have a doctor's appointment. I could just take the whole day as a sick day, or I could call in the morning and remote participate and then go to my doctor's appointment in the afternoon. So do you want that kind of flexibility, or do you just, I have enough sick days. I could probably take off until like 2024, right?
You may want to.
But is it something that provides flexibility and fluidity to the committee as well as to the employee?
Allison?
So I think that's premature to talk about necessity. I mean, I think listening to Nadine, I think we need to balance it for the first year. I'm not sure it requires a necessity to be attached. It could be just effective and efficient or something else. But I think what we're learning is that people can be incredibly productive and productively participating remotely, and it may be very efficient for them on that particular day to be remote. As in Mike's example, some people, for a host, I think the first year and a half, the first year or so after COVID, I think we're just going to have to maybe not set all that in granite yet and accommodate, be very flexible, understanding and accommodating as we deal with young people who still are not vaccinated, as we deal with all the opportunities this has presented to us, as well as some of the challenges. But I would be loath to start talking about being too hard and fast on stuff until we've lived through a year of feeling it out.
I don't want to distrust anybody else, and I hope that everybody acts in good faith. But people will test the limits. And if something is not clear about what it is they have for flexibility, someone who takes advantage of that may not be able to be corralled by the appropriate authorities if it's not cast in stone in some fashion. So I want to believe everybody in this room and working in this building is going to act in good faith and responsibly. But there will be times that conflict will arise, and when conflict does arise, there has to be some legal way for someone in a supervisory role to corral that behavior. And I don't want to be cast in concrete necessarily, but I also don't want to leave it to chance that everybody's going to do the right thing.
So my understanding is that this committee is more focused on the building and on space, and JLMC is the management committee. I'm listening to both of you, I agree with both of you. And so that means it's still open and up in the air. And so I think this is the kind of policy that can take a little time to develop. It doesn't need to be done by August 15th.
No.
So if our recommendation is that the tools should be there and that there should be a way of addressing these issues, I think JLMC is probably better positioned to work out the issues. And we can not spend more time.
No, I completely agree with you. I think the impact it may have on space is actually an interesting question, particularly in this interim period until we have built an expanded piece of the State House, that during this interim period, this may provide some opportunity for space. So it does have some impact on space. That's all I guess. After hearing Nadine and Mike both.
Anything else, Michael? No. Thank you.
Oh, one other thing. Eric generously is going to have a tour for the legal staff who has not had that opportunity up to weekend tomorrow. Many of the attorneys are going to be in town for Britain's going away pizza party, and so before then they're going. You emailed that you're going to do it, right?
Oh, yes, I am going to do it. No, I was thinking about there was some.
The pizza party. He was thinking about the pizza. Come on.
Having a Homer Simpson moment, sorry.
Eric, I do have, if you're not going to be available, I do have the access. I was over there yesterday. There's
Oh, yeah, no, that's fine.
You got time.
Thank you.
I'm
Okay.
still tidying up, so it's.
He'll have a good time.
I noticed.
Eric will have a good time.
Like,
Eric always has a good time. And then he'll get maybe a piece of pizza too.
no, I don't know.
So Ron, are you ready to
Way
come
into
up?
it.
So the other important piece in terms of how we function as a legislative branch, of course, is our committee work. And our committee work is really being able to be carried out by our committee assistants. And there were times in the past that committees did not have committee assistants. And now we're in the world that every committee has their own assistant. And Peggy's with us. Good.
Wants to make sure that she's looking over my shoulders to what I say, I don't say. So
So I don't know.
a sense of reassurance, not intimidation.
So who is to speak? Is it you, Peggy? Is it Ron? You're muted, whoever. Peggy, you're muted.
It's me.
Okay.
For the record, Ron Wild. And I'm here as a committee assistant, but also as a member of the committee services support team. So there are 4 committee assistants, 3 assistants plus Peggy. We train, we monitor workflow, we give guidance and feedback throughout the year to the other committee assistants. So the 3 of us, Faith Brown and Julie Tucker, took a look at the questions that you were asking and came up with a combined response. I don't want to be one of those witnesses that gives you a document and then proceeds to read the document. I'll trust that you'll take a look at it. But I did have a few points that I wanted to highlight. To begin with, I just want to offer thanks that we've been invited to give our input. I do not envy your position that by August 15th, you're expected to gaze into your crystal ball and determine what the situation is going to be come January 15th. I think the only thing we know with certainty is that we will all be somewhat wrong as to what the situation will be actually when we start. And the other thing I wanted to say at the outset is committee assistants are tasked to facilitate the work of the committees. And we will do what you ask us to do as best as we can. And I've asked for our input. So that brings me to the few points that I'd like to offer some emphasis on. First of all, Zoom work, as you already know, is exhausting.
Yes.
It was at one point, it facilitated the work to be done, but it was also an impediment. Frankly, less work got done. We were every bit as busy, busier still, but at the end of the day, it felt like less work got done. Less progress in committees was happening. We feel very strongly that wherever the committees go, that's where the committee assistants need to be. The expectation is that if you are all back in the building, then the committee assistants will be back in the building. What that will look like, we don't know yet. Are we going to have committees in a cart and we're going to go from space to space? Are we going to be back in our rooms? These are all questions yet to be answered, and we understand that. But I will suggest that based on your decisions, it will influence how we do things. I mean, just on a simple basis. Let's say we take a room and 6 different committees are going to use that room in turn. Well, you're now creating ergonomic workspaces for 6 different employees and how they sit at the desk and what their chair is like. There are also IT considerations. If 6 different employees are logging into that workstation, it's not always as seamless as we might hope it would be. These are all things that you may, from a space point of view, make sense, but then we have to logistically figure out how to implement it. Michael already referenced the expectation of availability that took place for the last year and a half. There was a sense that we were always available, nights, weekends. I'm sure there was an expectation by on the legislators as well, by constituents, that you were always available. Always welcome to send us an email, but the expectation, because we were working at home, was that we were always on. And I think somehow we need to address that. Whatever we decide to do back in the building and what the room capacities are, staff are very strong in not wanting to be enforcers of room occupancy. It's not our job to say who can enter, and we certainly don't want to tell people to leave. I don't know whose job that will be, but I don't believe we have any authority, really. I don't know where the authority would come from for committee assistants to tell someone they have to leave. It's not a position we want to be in. We respectfully request that if we are going to be back in the building, that total building occupancy be considered. We don't want to go back to crowded hallways. We don't want to go back to crowded spaces, at least not next year. We're concerned that it will create a feeling of need on some people's part. They need to wear masks all day. As you know, it's very uncomfortable. It's tiring. It's counterproductive to workflow. I don't have an answer for you other than I see on the board the recognition that the building is a living museum, and museums handle flow all the time. They assign tickets based on the time of day. You're there for 2 hours, you're there for 4 hours. There are some people, perhaps like the press, who are there all day. But the building, I respectfully suggest, doesn't have to be at full maximum capacity every day, all day. That's our sense of it.
Can I just interrupt there?
Sure.
Was there, and for the assistants that you heard back, and Peggy, this is for you too, was there, in terms of the capacity and feeling that some days, every day it was full, was there a difference in terms of the assistants that felt that versus those that didn't feel that based on where they were in the building? If they were on the main floor of the lobby, or they were in the 30s, or they were in the 40s. What I'm thinking is the committee rooms in the 30s were much more exposed to more people because the card room had an exhibit, there was something happening up in the cafeteria, so there was more mingling going on. The lobby had more people coming and going. In the fourth floor, you're kind of isolated up there in the 40s. You don't have as much of the advocate public there unless they're coming in to testify. So I'm just wondering, was there a difference?
In the case of the 40s, which is where my committee room is, the hallways were always packed. Lobbyists and staff were always there. The rooms themselves are always packed. So regardless of what was going on in the cafeteria, if you're in your room and there's press and press cameras and witnesses and members of the public who just want to see what's going on, and the committee members themselves, it's a jam-packed room. And yes, then we would then be expected to run down to editing, to pick up a document, go down to the copy room to get a document, or make something that needed to be full format. We would go to the cafeteria to look for members, to tell them they're needed. So we would all be exposed to all the environments, regardless of where our specific room might be. I wanted also to comment on something else that Mike brought up, and that's the use of
Peggy, did you have your hand up?
Sure. I was just going to add that I don't know that it specifically, we had different answers based on where people were. I think it really comes down to people's philosophy. I myself, I would be comfortable going back to Senate Judiciary with the room packed. That's me. Many members of my staff felt much more strongly that it has to be much less people, and they're just much more cautious about the virus. So I don't know that it was necessarily based on where people were, what committee. It was more based on people's different philosophy and feeling about how safe they feel generally, I guess.
Thank you. I wanted to elaborate on something that Mike brought up about technology, use of technology. We had a situation where committee assistants as the attorneys, and editors were working at home, creating office spaces. There weren't. I know of at least one committee assistant who took her one bathroom and turned it into an office because it was the only place she could shut the door. But we also had and this all went unremunerated, use of heat, use of light, what have you. But we also had a situation with a growing use of personal cell phones.
Yeah.
There's never been an expectation that committee assistants have smartphones. I know when I started, going on 9 years now, I had one committee member I texted with, my chair. I now have all but one. And I'm wondering, every year we hear from the attorneys to the legislators to remind them to preferably use their work email. And you all use your personal email as well because of the sheer crushing volume of email otherwise. But we now have a situation where committee assistants are texting to legislators. They're using their phones for email to legislators. Excuse me?
Public record.
Is there a public records consideration? So one is, are we expecting committee assistants to use their own phones, or should there be a work phone? And are we running the risk of a public records question for member committee staff personal cell phones? I don't have an answer. I merely raised the question that it's happening already.
So Ron,
Yes, ma'am.
on that, I mean, it's how we functioned in Zoom so often. I mean, if our committee assistant in Senate Economic Development was in North Carolina, I mean, and if we had people who couldn't get into the Zoom wasn't working, or, a lot of it was just staff, direct committee needs that we texted. Without that ability, we couldn't communicate. I mean, you just can't communicate. So it became essential that we shared each other's cell phones and that we were able, that would have been a whisper otherwise. Otherwise, I'd get up and go over and whisper in his ear, so-and-so needs to be let in. Without that ability, texting became an essential tool of communication.
Certainly. And if you're sharing a screen, it is possible to work on your email as well, but it's a little more complicated. It's much easier to respond with your phone to emails.
And some of us can't do our email and be in a Zoom meeting. And some of us try really hard to stay focused on what we're doing.
Senator, I'm not offering any argument about that. I'm merely pointing out the ramification that there's an expectation that committee assistants have smartphones, which we've never said. And as Representative Emmons just said, is there a public records consideration about someone's personal cell phone? So it may be evident. For work.
Sorry, has there been?
Why don't I comment when he's done? Let him finish and then I'll comment after, if that's okay.
Senator?
Well, I was just going to follow up with, has there been some discussion, Peggy and Ron, about staff, committee assistants getting business cell phones? I mean, look at Eric. Eric has two phones right now, one business, one personal. And that is classic with every administrator. Everybody in the administration brings out in committee their two phones.
They have separate phones.
I have not been party to any of those discussions. Peggy and Mike may be.
I mean, I do not expect my committee assistants to use their cell phones if they are not comfortable. I have several committee assistants that are absolutely not comfortable using their personal cell phone. So I think if that's something that you guys want to use, then I think it would be appropriate that the state provides a separate cell phone for people. But I would also caution, again, the availability aspect that Ron brought up. Getting texts, nights, weekends. I personally, the only cell phone I have is Senator Sears. He's the only one that I text with. I don't have anybody else's cell phone. And, there are ways around it. But again, if it's something that you want to consider, I do think the state should provide it.
A couple of things. Representative Ansel commented that this is really building specific, and some of these discussions are more JLMC, but there are overlaps. So for example, when you say stay home if you're sick, well, right now, well, pre-COVID, at least in our committee, members were not allowed to vote if they weren't in the room. And I don't know that that has to facilitate that. Remote witness testimony was at the discretion of the chair. If, to testify by phone, to testify by Skype, now Zoom, to stay in the room by phone or other means while testimony is going on. That was all at the discretion of the chair. So there may have to be policy changes if you want to make it a matter of course. Committee assistants, even pre-COVID, could do a measure of their work at home. Staying home if sick would still require the meeting itself to be covered. I agree with you, Representative Ansel. I haven't been sick in 2 years, and it's been very nice. Thank you very much. One other thing I want to offer for you is whatever you come up with, we have to train to. And Peggy does hiring of new committee assistants. Upwards of a third of the committee assistants will be new. She starts interviewing October, November. We redo the training manual and the operational manual in November, December, and we do training in December. So that just gives you our timeline. So for example, if transcripts, for example, that becomes a reality and we have to interact with that somehow, we have to know that. We have to know what the procedures are going to be so we can train to it. It is possible that you are going to come to many forks in the road where you can go this way or you can go that way. And I respectfully request that you speak with Peggy and Mike, because one way may be a whole world simpler than another way. Our job is to implement as best we can the decisions you come up with, and we're looking forward to doing that. But lead time is really valuable. Are there any questions that I can respond to?
Questions, comments? Allison?
I can't even imagine people, it just shocks me that people are abusing the sort of office hour time particularly with committee assistants. I could see emailing legislative counsel when something occurs over the weekend, but only emailing them. So was that rampant, or was that just a few one-offs? The committee assisted contact. I mean, it's maybe a chair or something comes up on a Monday. I can see that, but I mean, was that a rampant problem, or is that really a one-off? A couple offs.
We each had, each of the support team members have a group of committee assistants we worked with most closely. So in my group of 6, I can tell you for 2 of them, it was an issue. I know that Peggy had to speak to at least one chair with some regularity on the subject.
Oh, well.
So I think it was mixed. We only hear about it as people complained about it.
Was that
as you point out, excuse me, sir?
Was that exacerbated by COVID?
I think it was exacerbated by the remote work environment. There's this notion, well, you're at home, you're working at home, you're always at home. I'll reach out to you at home. And it's fine to receive emails. We instruct committee assistants that they're under no obligation to respond on a Saturday night. If they wish to, that they may, but there's no expectation. There was, however, an expectation by some legislators that they should get an answer at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. It happened.
So did that feeling come from legislators that were new legislators, or was that just from folks across the board. The reason I ask that, it's not to point fingers by any means, but I'm real sensitive to the new folks who have come in, that they really haven't experienced what the legislative arena is in the building. They did it all through Zoom, so you don't pick up a lot of nuances. So that's why that's the intent of my question, is if new members were doing something like this because they just didn't know the flow of the building, or if it was just anybody.
Peggy may have her own response. My impression, strictly that, it was more veteran legislators than the new folks. The new folks
It's good to
were
know.
struggling to find their way, quite frankly. And
They didn't know it.
they didn't know to do it.
Right, now they do.
Now they do. I mean, that's good information to have.
Yeah.
And I can also say that there were many times where chairs would reach out on the weekend because that's when you guys are working sometimes. And I told my staff, the expectation is not that you don't have to answer till Monday. And I know many of you as chairs told the committee assistants the same. So part of it is we're a very dedicated bunch. And so part of it is committee assistants themselves they're dedicated and they wanted to answer you on the weekend, even though I'm sure many of you did tell them, you don't need to worry about this, deal with it on Monday. But there were a couple of veteran chairs that did expect their committee assistants to get back to them on the weekends late, send emails at 9:00 at night, expect something to be done by the next morning at 8:00. But I don't want to give you the impression that it's a huge problem, but I think Ron's point was, in this world of COVID, in texting and remote, I think it probably, people did maybe more than they would in person, I think is really the point. And I also just wanted to piggyback on a comment that Ron made. When you go to make these decisions, if you could check in with us, I think that's really important because, as an example, one thing that worked really well this session is that attorneys shared their screen because, again, we do a lot of work. Sometimes we have to do work during the committee meetings. We just don't have enough time to do it, all of the work we need to do when we're not meeting. So the the attorneys would share their screen when they were going over a bill. So that enabled us to be able to do some work behind the scenes. Moving forward, if a lawyer is sitting in a witness chair, they might not necessarily be able to do that. Or another witness, that's another thing. And I know we really want to get away from paper. So that's something that we really need to think about. My suggestion would be for all the legislators to bring their iPads to meetings so that you guys can look at documents on your iPad during the meeting. And another thing that we want to keep in mind is when we talk about witnesses, I know we want to definitely give witnesses the opportunity to Zoom in, but then it's going to be, say we have 6 or 7 witnesses Zooming in, then the committee assistant's almost managing 2 meetings because you've got people on the Zoom screen and you've got people, in person. So those are just there's going to be some challenges there that we just really need to be aware of. And, we can only do so much. I think Zoom meetings, you have to be much more present in Zoom meetings than when you're in person. And I know there's just lots of technical things to consider, but that's just something, to Ron's point, if you could, when you go to make these decisions, I really ask that you check in with us just to see how it would impact our ability to service you guys at the highest level, really is what it comes down to.
So Peggy, I appreciate if attorneys could share their screen. And I'm thinking back pre-COVID in the committee room where not all members are adapted their iPads.
Yep.
And sometimes if you're going through a draft that is a new draft that your lawyer has, and you're comparing it with your old draft, you may have the old draft up on the computer on your iPad, and you want the new draft posted up on the whiteboard. What occurred in my committee room was, in order to do that, sometimes the committee assistant could not use his laptop because that's how you were projecting it up on the screen. So that's an IT issue, but
So there are, we don't know the IT environment we're going to be in
Right.
next year. And to Peggy's point about potentially running two different meetings, in your case, in your scenario, there were several different possibilities. The attorney would literally plug in and have it all there. The attorney's laptop's not working. And then the committee assistant puts it up on the screen, which is fine, but that locks up the committee assistant's computer from doing anything.
or a witness comes in, they did not send their document in advance as they were requested, but they had it on their iPad or their laptop, so they could plug it in, but then that takes.
And there were times where editing was going on, the attorney wasn't there. I, as a committee assistant, would put it up on the screen and I would type away as instructed. So it's, any number of possibilities, but we need to know the environment we're going to be in.
And if you're going to do the YouTube live streaming, that's a job in itself. You know what I mean? And it's, these are just some of the things that I'm just a little bit concerned about,
Did Peggy, or Ron, were any of the assistants concerned about everything being out there live streaming on YouTube? Did they voice concern and what was that? Outside of the workload, but was there something else?
I think things that were said during, a lot of times chairs weren't very clear when to go live or when not to go live. So sometimes things were caught on live stream that the committee assistant sitting there saying, I don't think they wanted that on live stream, or, it was sort of out of our hands. But I just think all of us would probably admit there were things on live stream we were lucky we got to shut our screen off. But I think that just maybe things that were said that the committee assistant were thinking, I don't know if they wanted that on live stream. I think especially when we took breaks, there was just chances for mistakes. So then we always stopped live stream during the breaks, and that did help. I just think, again, things taken out of context. I know in my committee, there were definitely some things that members said that were completely taken out of context. And I felt really bad for that person.
That happened in my committee too.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear a little bit about what went on in other committees. I think like every bill is different, every attorney is different, every committee is different. I was just jotting down some things that we didn't use screen sharing, for example. I didn't like it because if we were on it, I couldn't text as easily because I did on my laptop. And so we didn't do it at all. I also was much more controlling, I think, about when people became a participant in the meeting. So you can control who gets to chat and so on they can watch, and then you invite them into the meeting when you're ready to hear from them. So you don't have to have all 6 people sitting there or 10 people or whatever. So that's a different thing. Chat, we all did differently. I did, when to go live differently than other people did. We virtually never met unless we were live. We didn't meet after the meeting and we didn't meet before the meeting. As soon as everyone was there, we were live. And so as I think about these things, there isn't a standard procedure for chairs in how to do any of this. And we probably all did it differently.
We did it differently.
And we could learn from one another. Some things I did that I messed up and some things that maybe were a good idea. But
And
haven't really done that.
our committee, I only used speaker view.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right? There was no reason for me to have to look at 12 heads while I'm working.
Exactly.
And no
I like
reason.
looking at them.
Right.
because I
So
guess
it was
there's
only
so
speaker
much
view.
going.
I need to see everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you could, but what the public saw is what was going on my computer.
What you're controlling.
And I only use speaker view.
And that's what went out on YouTube. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
So
how did that get, Were committee assistants aware of that? And how many of them did that speaker view?
They were aware of it. Don't know how many did. It was our recommendation that they do it that way with the chair's agreement, but.
Yeah, basically, we asked the chairs how they wanted it.
But I'm not sure the chairs understood the
Consequences.
There were things, as we progressed really over 2 years, best practices began to emerge from the Zoomverse. And one is that a multi-headed screen looking at 12, 20, 120 faces is really hard on your brain. It hurts to try to focus on that many images at one time.
Problem running a committee, too many faces.
Well, actually, one of the other things that happened is if you turned your video off, even though if you were fully participating, it looked as though you weren't there.
Yes.
I don't think people realize that. So it just looked as though you walked out, but you were sitting right there listening.
Maybe.
But you turned your video off.
Sometimes you're
Maybe.
faking an expression you didn't want people to see.
Yeah. So
Cat walked across.
there's a lot that we should learn from one another and how to manage it.
But, this is good, helpful that we do need standard procedures and best practices. And I love your term Zoomverse. It's a great new term.
Peggy, since you and I are on the same committee in the morning, I'm thinking about how we develop legislation. One of my concerns has been with the Zoom environment. Not only are your attention spans being taken by trying to control the media, ours is as well. Frankly, I felt pretty ashamed at some of the legislation we were working on. When we get to a point where we have a bill going to the governor that needs to be accompanied by a letter of what our intent was, to me, I find that very problematic. So personally, I hope that when we develop, in my case, judiciary language that starts with a draft and could have 6 or 7 iterations by the time it leaves our committee, I always like to have that paper trail in a file where I've drawn in the margins who is objecting to what language and what needs to change. I hope we never lose that. And the more we take our focus away from that paper trail to try to adjust to the media that we're now using, I think becomes problematic for our eventual work product. That's just my opinion. I'm going to say I would prefer that we keep the paper trail and not go straight to a medium that we're looking at on a screen.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to the committee, and if they want paper copies, they'll get paper copies. One thing to keep in mind, if you're going to be sharing, I know you guys have talked about possibly sharing Senate rooms. Some of those Senate rooms are a mess with paper. So those members will have to figure out what to do with their big pile of papers when they need to go somewhere else.
Listen, I served with Obie. Nobody had a bigger pile than Janet and I had to deal with.
I served at Cola Hudson too.
Yeah. So when we couldn't see Obie's eyebrows anymore, then we complained.
Is that why the commissioner's office looked like that when we got there?
Yes, that is exactly
Had a paper trail.
Is that where?
Obie loved paper. And just remember, Peggy, paper is a Vermont product.
Obie and Cola.
We love paper. We love
Again,
paper.
it's totally up to you guys. I mean, I know I think generally there's a push to use less paper, but if you as a committee still want paper, the committee system will do that. Again, I'm just reminding you, it may sound silly, but if you're going to share Senate rooms, senators are going to have to pick up their stuff when they leave and bring it somewhere else.
I will offer also that when members are using laptops and they have stacks of bills that they've picked up from the bins and other things, you're blocking the microphones. And if we go to these center table cameras that they're experimenting with, you'll be blocking those as well. Just that's
We're going to have IT protocol.
That's an example of when you decide to go one way, it's going to have a ramification that it's our job to at least inform you of.
Exactly.
So Peggy, I just, I wasn't here last week. I don't know if you were given the opportunity to express your true opinion on Senate committee rooms having to be shared.
Yes, she did.
I did give my opinion. I just think I will tell you guys, it is extremely important that committee assistants have their own dedicated workspace. For morale, we all have our own space. We have our files, especially on the Senate side, when we do have paper, we need to have a dedicated workspace. We cannot have committee assistants work in the morning and then pick up all their stuff and belongings and have to walk around the building looking for a place to work. That would be demoralizing. It would absolutely hinder our ability to do the best work that we can do. So, that's just something that I feel really strongly about. What that looks like is one thing, but I'm just saying we need to have, each committee assistant has to have their own dedicated workspace to go to.
Right. We heard that.
To share spaces, they need to be able to go somewhere else that's just theirs, if that makes sense.
Right.
So Peggy, I do have a question, but I don't want to get into this issue in depth at this point, but there are some committees in the Senate that don't have as high a workload as some other committees. Would it be possible for some of those committees to share committee assistants?
We've tried that. And it doesn't seem to work, to be honest with you. What I tell committee assistants that are in half-day committees, that part of their job is to also cover when other committee assistants are out, or if I need help with something. Now, it is true, there are some committee assistants that have lesser of a workload. That is absolutely true. And a lot of times they may not work 40 hours. But giving someone 2 committees, we've tried it in the past and it has not worked well, to be honest with you.
Butch, did you have your hand up? Oh, I thought you did.
Well, the hearing, yeah, I do have something. Hearing everybody's concerns about space and where they're going to be and what the configuration is going to be of the building, the possible building, I guess says to me that the sooner we can figure this space thing out, a lot of these other dominoes are going to fall into place.
Right.
And maybe relieve some of the anxiety of the staff once we make those decisions. So, and
Segue into the next part of our agenda.
got it.
So Ron, anything else? I know I see a couple more hands here. Mike and then Alice.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Just to Mike Front, Director of Legislative Operations, and something that I heard about the separation of work and personal life came to mind at the beginning of the session. Peggy had hired her new committee staff, and we were kind of going over some logistics. And as the director of the unit, I was asked, so what is my work day? I put my timesheet 8 hours. When do I start work and when do I stop work and when do I eat lunch? When do I get these employment basic questions that until remote work were very easy to answer. You show up at 7:45, you leave at 4:30 if you work past it's overtime. And I think all state employees, I think everyone experienced this. All of a sudden, there's no more office to go to. There's no more checking in. There's no coming into the workplace that starts your day and no leaving the workplace that ends your day. And so what constitutes the 8-hour workday for remote work for the legislature? When you folks work all kinds of hours and all kinds of stuff. And I just want to kind of leave you with that thought that it's a very different, that was the biggest shift that I saw, was coming into the office begins your workday when you log in to your computer and you sit down. And then when you're done for the day, you leave and that's the end of your workday. And there's this expectation that you're going home to your personal life and no one's going to bother you. With remote work, that line became very, very blurry. So I just a thought that I had, and I remembered that conversation.
And we had that on a weekly basis as legislators, particularly those that stayed up here during the week. Because on Friday you go back home. And we were home. So we had the same dynamic.
Yeah.
So I never experienced that, Mike. I mean, I found legislative council often works at night after the kids go to bed and they do a lot of drafting. The lawyers do. So, I mean, that was pre-pandemic too. So, I mean, I think everybody just works differently. I do a ton of work over the vegetables at Max, I mean, we all do work wherever we are, but for certain staff, maybe had expectations of an 8-hour day, but I know a lot of staff work all over the place to get work done.
Oh, yes, I wasn't indicating that
Yeah.
staff only wanted to work 8 hours. It was more about that blurry line of when does it start and when does it end when you're working from home.
Right, your boundaries.
Yes, that's-
Yeah.
Boundaries.
Yeah, that was the, that,
Boundaries that you did not have.
We have,
when did overtime begin?
We have no boundaries, which is a problem, and we have no dedicated, I might point out, legislators have no dedicated workspace except maybe their desk on the floor. So it's a luxury to have a dedicated workspace, which none of us have, and that's what's so hard about losing the lounge, quite honestly, is that particularly for those of us who are in 2 different committee rooms, it's, that's a challenge. And because some of us, work late into the night in the lounge, and that's as close dedicated workspace as we get.
I just like to, I would hope that would change somewhat in that everyone was doing such critical work because of the pandemic and to get people help. So I think that kind of magnified the expectation. The committees needed to meet now because tomorrow morning we had to get on the floor to vote on something so we could help people. You could help people, which everyone did such a remarkable job, including all of the committee staff. So I'd hope in a regular, normal time, it would maybe lessen somewhat, and some very good lessons learned by it.
Okay. So I'd like to take a break. Anything else, Ron?
Just when you're considering space, Peggy referenced, we have shared rooms. There still needs to be a place where the committee assistant goes back to work. There has to be a place where you all go back to. I mean, one of the real burdens of COVID remote sessions was I didn't have access to my chair. I didn't have access. I couldn't just take a moment and speak to a member about a question they had or a document they were looking for or a request that was coming in that I needed to share with them. If there needs to be a place where people are. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Let's take a break and then we'll.
During break, I have 2 types of cookies for us.
Are there other folks that wanted to testify on this particular issue before we shift gears to talking about possible committee rooms and what BGS might need to do to those rooms? Is there anyone else? Well, I was looking at JFO and I'm looking at IT. I don't know.
That would
Yes or
be
no?
helpful to hear from them.
JFO, we talked about it briefly last week in staff meeting, and I sent out a reminder yesterday. I didn't get a lot of comments back, except for very similar echo of the optionality for staff when needed to have whatever the technology for remote, that same optionality that would be there for members for remote testifiers. And at one point in the last conversation that I'd like to make, because it happened to me last week, I was one of the few remote people remoting into a physical meeting. And that's a very different feeling than being fully at the physical meeting and being everyone remote. And so your idea of protocols and sort of a rubric of the protocols for fully live, the protocols for fully remote, and the protocols for a hybrid are important because it was a jarring experience not being able to follow the full physical meeting as a remote person. Very different than when everyone's remote and you're focusing in a different way. So,
Yeah. That's a hybrid. That's going to be a big challenge with hybrid.
Kevin?
Kevin Moore with State IT. So a lot of our thoughts have already been discussed. We have a couple other things. I'm happy to come to the table real quick and just discuss it, but I don't want to stand in the way of a break.
Yeah, I'm just wondering with IT, if we spend really schedules time for IT and really get into depth on some of this.
I think that would be valuable. I'm coming at it with today's conversation more from a workforce perspective, with a couple of tidbits of technology, but more about people and how people in IT had weathered the pandemic.
So why don't we take a break? I'm back with you, Kevin, and then that might be a good segue to Joe Asia to figure out the committee rooms, because we wanted to see what renovations, if any, were needed to any of those other rooms, which hopefully there's no renovations needed.
I don't think